All right, well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week number 6 for PPA 500. So our time as a class is drawing very near. We're almost out of time. So this is week number 6. If everything goes right for us and we cover the information we need to cover, we have class tonight. We'll then have a Zoom session next week. And then on March 12th, if we have everything covered and done by that point in time, then instead of having a live Zoom session on March 12th, we'll be able to just afford you that time to work on your final assessment and really kind of use that time just as kind of independent work on the final, because the final would then be due by midnight on March the 12th. So that is our goal. We will see how we progress. I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off to save some bandwidth. So, okay, hopefully we won't have any connection issues. I apologize. My voice is a little off, and you may hear me huffing and puffing a little bit when I'm talking because I'm sick again. And so it seems like ever since I had COVID back in December, I've just been picking everything up that I come into contact with. And so I got sick the morning I was leaving to go to DC last week, and I'm still dealing with it. So I apologize for that, but we'll work our way through and make sure we get through all the material we need to get through tonight. Before we get into that material for this evening, though, just a quick reminder is that you have Canvas essay number 5, which is due next week, next Tuesday, March the 5th by midnight. And again, in Canvas essay number 5, you'll be selecting a public policy of your choice. It can be a policy in really any policy area that you are interested in. So it could be a policy from education policy or healthcare policy or housing policy or welfare policy or criminal justice policy or environmental policy or really any area that you're interested in. You'll select one public policy to use as an example, and then you'll discuss which decision-making model was used in the creation, the formulation of that public policy. So for the decision-making models, you'll be selecting from those 4 decision-making models that we covered last week when we talked about policy analysis: rational comprehensive, incrementalism, mixed scanning, and garbage can model of decision-making. So which of those decision-making models do you think were reflected in the way in which that policy was formulated? And then if you think there's another decision-making model that would have been a superior one to use, what decision-making model would have been superior to the one that was used? So as you're looking at the formulation of this policy, you're going to ask questions such as, is this policy a big departure, a big change from the way in which we have dealt with this policy issue before? Is this a real market departure from the way in which we have dealt with it in the past? If so, then there's probably some bit of rational, comprehensive thinking going on in the formulation of that policy. By contrast, if it's a policy that is relatively similar in approach to the approaches we've used in previous years, it's just kind of a modification of what we've always done, that's probably going to be an indicator of much more incrementalist type of decision making. If you kind of see a combination of the two, and so you see there's a little rationality, a little incrementalism, that could then suggest to you mixed scanning. And if you are looking at the formulation of the policy and you see that a change was made to the policy or a new policy was developed as the result of some type of an event that happened, then some type of triggering event, then you might be looking at something more like garbage can model of decision making. But again, which model of decision making was used and justify that. And then if there's another decision making model that would have been more appropriate, which decision making model would have been more appropriate? So that's Canvas essay number 5. That is your final graded Canvas essay for the course, and that is then due next Tuesday by midnight. Then you have your final assessment, and that final assessment is due by midnight on March the 12th. Now, I know that some of you are still putting the finishing touches on your midterm assessment that is due by midnight tonight. Don't forget about that. If you haven't turned in the midterm yet, that is due by midnight. I know several people have already turned in the midterm, and I've had a chance to grade all the midterms that came into Canvas by about 2:30 today. So if you submit it by 2:30, your midterm's probably already graded. But if you haven't submitted it yet, please remember it needs to be submitted no later than midnight tonight. But because we have 2 weeks left until the final assessment is due, 2 weeks left in our class together, to make good on my promise, I made the final assessment available to you on Canvas, and just like we did with the midterm, I'd like to spend some time at the outset of class tonight going through the final assessment, highlighting the 5 scenarios and the 10 questions on the final assessment. And just to reiterate, the ground rules are the same on the final as they were on the midterm. And in going through and grading the midterms, I'm very happy with the grades so far. The grades are all in the A category, maybe a few in the very high B range, but everyone's doing well on the midterm. So the approach you use on the midterm assessment, to use a similar type of approach on the final assessment, and you should do very well. So again, parsimonious answers, 1 to 2 paragraphs certainly for each question would certainly be enough to suffice. And again, that's what most people did on their midterms, and it's worked out very well to date. So let me go through the scenarios on the final assessment, and then we'll go over any questions you may have about them. But it's the same type of format that you just did with your midterm. So in your first scenario here, the scenario is you applied for a position with the United States Department of Veterans Affairs as a policy analyst in January. In March, you received notice that you have been advanced to the next round of selection and will be selected for a schedule for an interview in early April. Finally, in late April, you are contacted again and an interview occurs on May 15th. During the interview, you are told the process is ongoing and you'll be informed of the next steps within the next 6 weeks. In early June, your friend referred you to a job with a private sector marketing firm. You apply, are interviewed, and are hired on the spot. You accept the position with the private firm, but lament the lost opportunity with the Department of Veterans Affairs. In early July, the department contacts you with a job offer that you must politely decline because you've already accepted a position with this private marketing firm. Question 1A, why did it take so long for the hiring process to occur in the federal government? What are some of the differences in working for the public versus the private sectors? We will cover this information, some of this information at the last part of class tonight when we talk about federal employment and how federal employment has evolved and changed over the past 200 years. We'll also pick up on this information again next week when we talk about the management of human resources in the public sector. Then question 1B, the evolution of hiring in the federal government has trended toward hiring people based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities as opposed to which political party they support. Please discuss the 3 main eras of public employment and the evolution of hiring from the late 1700s until today. What era of employment are we currently in today? So for this one, this is information that you'll get at near the end of class tonight when we go through the evolution of the hiring at the federal level. We will talk about the era of gentlemen, the era of spoils, and the era of merit, and why we transition from one period of employment to another. And we'll kind of track it from the founding of the nation up to modern times. So you'll have all the information you need for question 1B by the conclusion of our session tonight. Then we have scenario number 2. The maintenance department of the Department of Public Works maintains all public facilities within the city of Treetown. Treetown is a well-maintained community and prides itself on the cleanliness of its public facilities. However, as the city has grown over the past several years, the number of public facilities has grown as well. This has resulted in maintenance workers being asked to do more and often to complete work outside of their position descriptions. As a result, the maintenance workers bargaining unit files a grievance that the additional new work has changed the work conditions of maintenance employees. This grievance eventually makes its way into the collective bargaining negotiations, and management and the bargaining unit have been struggling to come to an agreement over the issue. The bargaining unit declares an impasse when it's apparent that no agreement is on the horizon. So in question 2A, what impasse resolution processes are available to the bargaining unit and to the agency? Please discuss the 3 primary impasse resolution options. And so basically in this collective bargaining process, we now have an impasse that has been declared. And once the impasse is declared, then to break that impasse, there are 3 different strategies that we will talk about called fact-finding, mediation, and arbitration. And we'll talk about those in the very last part of class tonight. So you'll get the information tonight to be able to answer question 2A. Then question 2B, if you were a new director for this agency and had to direct your human resources manager to correct the issues of employees working outside of their descriptions, what functions of human resource management should your human resource manager do? And so with this one, we are looking at the functions of managing human resources. Things like job analysis, job evaluation, performance evaluation, those types of discrete functions of human resource management, we will talk about next week. And that'll be what we'll begin our class with next week. So you have the information for 2B at the conclusion of the class next week. Then scenario number 3. The city of Preble Heights is struggling with its budget. It uses a simple line item budget and typically increases expenditures each year in connection with increases in GDP rate, gross domestic product. Over the past 5 years, the city failed to complete the budget on time and struggled to balance revenues and expenditures. The city auditor found that many programs are inefficient and are not achieving their goals and objectives. Standard & Poor's and Moody's both reduced the city's credit rating due to its budget issues. Whenever governments borrow money, whenever they issue debt, they have to get a credit rating. The credit rating is based upon some similar factors that we would be familiar with in our own personal credit rating. So things such as their timeliness of paying their bills, their ability to balance their budget, their ability to make debt payments on time. And so Standard & Poor's and Moody's both reviewed the city's credit rating and reduced its credit rating, lowered its credit rating, which then will make it more difficult for the city to borrow money. As a city council member, you and your colleagues need to recommend a new budgeting format to try and alleviate these concerns. So in question 3A, select and recommend a new budget format for the city that will address the concerns in this scenario. And then, so what we will do next week is in the second half of class, we will talk about different budget formats and the reasons why you might use one budget format as compared to another budget format. And so when we talk about those budget formats, I'll introduce you to 4 different budget formats: line item budgeting, performance-based budgeting, program-based budgeting, and zero-based budgeting. I also have links on our Canvas site for next week where I provide examples of what those 4 different budget formats look like, but we'll talk about all that next week. You'll be selecting one of those 4 budget formats and recommend their use for the city. That would hopefully be that budget format would help address those concerns that were brought up in this scenario. So select a budget format that you think would be most appropriate for the city to adopt. Then in 3B, the city's aquatic center needs renovation. Given the city's fiscal problems, it is clear the city lacks the resources to complete the project without borrowing money. The aquatic center is open to citizens for lap swimming Monday through Saturday from 2 p.m. to 7 p.m. Citizens pay a $3 fee to use the facility, and 100 residents use the facility for lap swimming. And they do it 200 days out of the year. The city also charges a $20,000 per year fee to the school district and club swim teams to use the facility for practices. A total of 6 teams pay that fee. The operating expenses for the aquatic center amount to $180,000 per year. Since the city does not have the money to pay for renovations, it proposes a bond to cover the cost. And by a bond, we mean they're going to borrow money in order to cover the cost of the renovation of the aquatic center. Which type of bond would you recommend and why? Next week, when we talk about the management of fiscal resources, we will talk about different types of bonds, different ways in which you can borrow money as a municipality. We'll talk about things like general obligation bonds and revenue bonds and double barrel bonds, and talk about the advantages and disadvantages of each one of those. For question 3B, what you'll be doing is selecting one of those bonds that we talked about last week and recommending that for the city to use and why you would recommend that bond. Now, the numbers you see in there, they're all there to help you kind of get a sense of how much revenue the aquatic center is bringing in versus how much revenue the aquatic center has to spend on an annual basis. One of the bonds we'll talk about next week, a revenue bond, is a bond that is repaid with the revenue that's generated from the facility. So in order to issue a revenue bond, the facility would have to generate a good deal more revenue than it is spending in expenditures in order to be able to pay off that bond. But again, this is all information that you'll get next week, and you'll be able to answer both of these questions for scenario 3 after we are done with our discussion next week. Scenario number 4. The city of Preble Heights also has a unit known as the Economic Revitalization Department, or the ERD. ERD's primary task is to implement a policy known as the Urban Revitalization Initiative. The initiative provides cash grants to businesses who renovate their facilities and remain in urban areas as opposed to moving to other states. The primary beneficiaries of these grants are obviously business owners who are willing to stay where they are and continue to contribute to economic growth in urban areas of the city, which would be primarily the downtown area. To be successful, the policy would need to provide enough grant money to offset the cost savings of potentially moving to other states and areas. Not all members of the ERD are in favor of the policy goals and believe it is not the role of government to influence business decisions. These employees have sometimes been accused of slow walking grant applications to delay the payment of money to applicants. So you obviously have some folks within the organization who don't believe in the policy, and so they are delaying the processing of these grant applications. From a policy implementation perspective, utilize Pressman and Waldowski's implementation research to illustrate some of the barriers to successfully implementing this policy. And this is information we covered last week. Drawing upon the 4 models of organizational effectiveness, examine this scenario from the perspective of each of these models. How would each model define the agency's effectiveness in implementing this policy? Tonight, once we finish our discussion of the role of public administrators in implementing and evaluating public programs, we will then turn our attention to this question of what is effectiveness. And I'll introduce you to 4 different models of how we can measure effectiveness in public organizations. And so what you'll be doing is drawing upon those 4 models. How would each of those models help the agency define effectiveness in the implementation of this policy? But this is information you'll get in class tonight. So 4A, you already have the information. 4B, you'll get the information in class tonight. Then we have our final scenario, scenario number 5. It has now been 2 years since Preble Heights renovated its recreation center. So not only is it now planning on renovating its aquatic center, it had already been in the process of renovating its recreation center. That renovation's been done for 2 years. The Parks and Recreation Commissioner, Julia Lopez, approached the council last year with a proposal to address juvenile delinquency in the city. The city has seen a rise in the incidence of graffiti and vandalism over the past several years. Ms. Lopez proposed creating a program of after-school sports offered free of charge at the recreation center. The after-school sports program is offered from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Friday and 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. on Saturdays. The goal of the program is to give youth something to do after school and deter them from engaging in acts of graffiti and vandalism. The program has been up and running for 1 year. You are a program specialist, and the city manager has approached you to create a program evaluation to evaluate the effectiveness of the after-school sports program. So as a program specialist, you have to come up with a design, if you will, to try and assess the effectiveness of this after-school sports program. Question 5A, identify and discuss the variables you'll use, the primary independent variable, dependent variable, and control variables that you would use in your program evaluation. And then in 5B, identify and discuss the evaluation or research design that you would recommend using to evaluate the program's effectiveness. That's information that we're going to cover in the first part of class tonight when we talk about program evaluation. We'll talk about identifying variables in program evaluation studies. We'll talk about different types of evaluation designs and which evaluation designs tend to work better in which types of situations. So this is all information that you will get in class tonight. So that is the final assessment, those 5 scenarios. Again, 1 to 2 paragraphs for each one of the questions would certainly be enough to get the job done. Like I said, so far, everyone's done well in the midterm assessment. So use the same approach on the midterm assessment, use that same approach on the final assessment, and you should do well. This final assessment is due by midnight on Tuesday, March the 12th, which is technically our final night of our abbreviated semester together. So at this point in time, are there any general questions about the final assessment before we jump into our material for tonight? As you look at it and as you start thinking about working on some of these scenarios, questions may emerge. If they do, send me an email. I am heading out of town tomorrow morning once again, but this time I'm going to Northern California for accreditation site visit. So I will be there Wednesday, Thursday, and almost the entire day on Friday, coming back late Friday night. But I will have access to my email. These accreditation site visits are pretty intensive. And so if you email me on Thursday, you're probably gonna have to wait until Thursday night to get a response from me because it's just kind of meeting after meeting during the day. But I will respond to you with any questions that you have, even though I will be out and about and on the road. Okay. Okay. Let's go ahead and share out our slides for tonight. So what we're going to do in the first half of class tonight is we're just going to pick up where we left off last week. And as I told you last week, we started our discussion of the functions of public administration. And this final part of the class, we talked about some of the things that we do as public administrators within public organizations. So last week, we talked about the role of public administrators in the formulation, implementation, and evaluation of public policies. We talked about some of the differences between a public policy and a public program. We identified public policies as kind of being these overarching types of goals, and then the public programs are kind of the stanchions that then hold that overarching public policy up. So since policies are much more general in nature, and public programs are much more specific, there are probably going to be different methods and different approaches that we use to analyze a policy as opposed to evaluating a public program. So the approaches we use in evaluating a public program will tend to be more along the lines of those classic social science research methods that you learned at the undergraduate level in your research methods course. Now, in our program, we teach program evaluation as part of PPA 696 research methods. So we still call the course research methods, but the content of the course is program evaluation. The reason why the name hasn't changed is just the curriculum process is somewhat cumbersome and somewhat involved, and even just changing the name of a course means you got to put together a whole new CSO the course outline, and there's a lot of work that goes into it that I don't know, we kind of decided, if we can still call it research methods, but then teach it more program evaluation, because when we teach program evaluation, we are still referencing social science research methods. We're just taking those social science research methods and we are placing them within the service of evaluating public programs. So this information we're going to talk about here in the first part of class tonight will foreshadow a lot of the information that you'll cover much more in depth once you get to PPA 696 research methods. So we know that public administrators have a role to play, certainly in implementing public programs and then also evaluating those public programs. But we want to make sure that the programs that we are implementing are making progress toward the achievement of their stated goals. If we have a program that's not achieving its stated goals, then we'd obviously would either want to eliminate that program and replace it with something that will achieve the goals, or go back and reformulate that program to make it more likely that it will achieve its stated goals. So we want to know how effective the program is so we can make changes to the program. That's what program evaluation is all about, is to provide that information that you can then feed back into the program formulation process so that you can make your programs more effective. So the primary purpose of program evaluation is to apply empirical methods to determine the effectiveness of a public program. Now, we have talked in a previous class session about this term empirical and what empirical is. We said Max Weber, as a classic organization theorist, was a big believer in empirical information. He was a big believer in collecting this empirical, tangible information information you can collect, information you can measure, information you can sense. That's what we consider to be empirical information. So we're going to collect this tangible information and then use this tangible information to then render decisions about the effectiveness of this public program. So in program evaluation, when you do 696, you will learn some of these methods that you will use in collecting this tangible information and analyzing the tangible information as well. When we evaluate public programs in public administration, we typically do it from a couple of different perspectives. One type of evaluation is a program impact evaluation. And with an impact evaluation, we are looking at the outcome of the program, how well the program is achieving its stated outcomes and its stated goals, what impact is it having on citizens who are beneficiaries of those programs. And or we could do a program implementation evaluation where we will look at the nuts and bolts of how this program is being implemented on a daily basis in a public organization. Now, those two types of evaluations are certainly not mutually exclusive. You can certainly combine an impact orientation with an implementation orientation, all in the same program evaluation. But if you're doing an impact evaluation, your approach is going to be a little bit different than if you're doing an implementation type of an evaluation. The data that you're going to collect from an impact evaluation will oftentimes come from the beneficiaries of the program. An implementation evaluation, your information is probably going to come from within the organization and the people, the bureaucrats, the public administrators who are actually going through the process of implementing this program on a daily basis. For our purposes in our brief discussion tonight, we are going to look at program impact evaluations, because a program impact evaluation is the most common type of evaluation that we do in public administration. And since it is so common, that's why it's the focus of an entire core course, PPA 696. So how do we do a program impact type of evaluation? But the steps we go through will be somewhat similar to the steps that you went through in your undergraduate research methods course in doing a classic social science research project. So as you know from undergraduate research methods, the first thing you do is you have to identify the purpose or your research question. And what are you trying to do? What question are you trying to answer with your research? It's the same thing here in program evaluation. What is our evaluation purpose? What is our evaluation question? We hope that we can write what's considered to be a good evaluation question. Good evaluation questions, like good research questions, are clear. They are understandable to everyone, so everyone knows what these questions are asking. They know what the terms mean in these evaluation questions, so they're clear questions. They also need to be answerable. They need to be questions where you can answer them through the collection and analysis of empirical information. If it's a question that's based upon someone's beliefs, that's not going to be something that can be answerable necessarily with empirical information. So it must be something you can actually answer. And it needs to have more than one possible answer. If there's only one possible answer to a question, chances are we probably already know what that answer is. So it needs to be answerable. It needs to have more than one possible answer. And that's what kind of makes up the characteristics of what we consider to be a good evaluation question. So here are a couple examples on the screen that, as I like to say, are ripped from the headlines, in that these are questions that came out of a 697 research methods case study from probably about a decade ago now, so from quite a while ago. And in that case study, the goal of the case study was to try and determine the impact of participation in a reading program on rates of recidivism for incarcerated individuals. And so essentially what we were doing in the case study is we had created this inmate reading intervention program, otherwise known as IRIP. And that IRIP was meant to engage incarcerated individuals, engage inmates in reading to increase literacy rates for the purpose of eventually hoping that that will then have a decrease in rates of recidivism. So a very simple type of evaluation question could have been, does the inmate reading intervention program decrease rates of recidivism? That, as you can see, is a directional type of question in that we are presupposing that people who participate in the reading program will then have lower rates of recidivism. That participation in the program will lower those rates of recidivism. So we're saying decrease, and so it's a directional type of evaluation question. An alternative wording of the question is, how does the inmate reading intervention program affect rates of recidivism? That's a non-directional question. So we are allowing for the possibility that participation in the program may decrease rates of recidivism, but we're also allowing for the possibility that it may increase rates of recidivism as well. That's a non-directional, what we call a two-tailed type of evaluation question. So those are just two very simple types of examples of evaluation questions. When you took undergraduate research methods, you may have been told that you try to avoid the does types of questions, the is types of questions, and you kind of trend more toward the how questions. Because whenever you ask how, you are providing for more robust data, and there are many different ways of answering that question, much more so than asking does. So if asking the question does, well, either yes, it does, or no, it does not. You've got two alternative answers there. How provides a lot more detail, and a lot more possibility for robust, more nuanced data that can be collected. And I think that's very true. We usually try to ask how as opposed to does questions, but when we're in the world of program evaluation, we have very limited time, we have very limited resources, and we need an answer about the effectiveness of this program yesterday. We may be better served with a more simple does type of question as opposed to a how question. So it really depends upon the context in which the evaluation is being done. But your question should be clear, it should be answerable, and it should have more than one possible answer. Now, your question is probably going to postulate some type of or ask about some type of relationship between your variables. At the undergraduate level, you learned about variables, so everyone's familiar with what a variable is. At its very heart, a variable is a phenomenon that can vary in value. If it doesn't have the potential to vary in value, it's not a variable, it's a constant. So here we're looking at variables. Variables in program evaluation need to be very well operationalized. They need to be specific, and they need to have empirical operational definitions. So in classic social science research methods, we are looking at the relationship between independent and dependent variables. As you know, a dependent variable is the variable that is being affected. It's the variable that is being changed. The independent variable is the variable that is doing the changing, the variable that is having an impact upon the dependent variable. So for our questions on the previous slide, the recidivism rates, that would serve as a dependent variable, and then participation in the IRIP program would serve as our primary independent variable. In program evaluation, the dependent variable, the variable that is being changed, typically tends to be the measure of the outcome of the program. So this is the outcome of the program that we are hoping to achieve, lower recidivism rates. So recidivism rates would be the dependent variable. The independent variable, the primary independent variable that we are interested in, is in some measure of that public program. So there are different ways we can develop our public program. So if you think about the reading intervention program, one measurement of that program could be whether or not someone participated in the program. So some people participated in the program, some people did not participate in the program. Those who participated in the program could be scored a 1. Those who did not participate in the program could be scored a 0. That's kind of this binary type of approach for measurement. That's one way we could measure participation in the program. We want to be a little bit more nuanced. We could also measure participation in the program in terms of frequency of participation. So we could look at the number of times per week or the number of hours that someone participated in the program. And that's another way we could measure that independent variable of program participation. A different way in which we could measure that variable is, instead of measuring program participation, we could measure program existence. So we could look at recidivism rates in the years before the program was implemented, and look at recidivism rates in the years after the program was implemented. So if it was a year before the program was implemented, that variable would be scored as 0. If it's a year after the program was implemented, then it would be scored as a 1. So we don't always have to do participation in the program. We can measure it as the existence of the program, whether or not the program was in existence. But however you're measuring it, that primary independent variable in program evaluation is going to be some measure of the public program itself. So just like in classic social science research methods, here in program evaluation, we are trying to isolate the relationship between the primary independent variable and the dependent variable, participation in the program and recidivism rates. But we also know that there are a lot of other variables out there that can independently affect recidivism rates outside of participation in the IRIP program. So some things that can affect recidivism rates could be things such as the type of crime that was committed. Was it a violent crime? Was it a non-violent crime? Was it a crime that involved drugs? Was it a crime that did not involve illegal drugs? Because we know that crimes that involve illegal drugs tend to have higher recidivism rates attached to them than ones that do not involve illegal drugs. We could ask the question in terms of another variable, such as the number of offenses. So was this a first-time offense, or was this a multiple offense? If it's a first-time offender, that there's probably a less of a chance that they will return to prison and reoffend than if they were a multiple offender. Whether or not the person has a verifiable address is oftentimes another indicator of whether or not they will reoffend. So you've got all these other control variables. You create these control variables so that you can control their values, so you can isolate the relationship between participation in the program and recidivism rates. If we see a change in recidivism rates, we want to be able to say with confidence that yes, this change in recidivism rates was due to people participating in this reading intervention program. And that's our entire goal here with the program impact evaluation, is to isolate the relationship between the program and its intended outcome. So then once we have identified our variables and we have figured out how we're going to measure those variables, we then have to select a evaluation or research design. The research design looks at which of our subjects, for dealing with human beings, which of our subjects will be exposed to the independent variable and which of those will not be exposed to the independent variable. So in classic social science research, you know you have experimental and control groups. The experimental group is the group of people who are exposed to the independent variable. The control group will be the group of people who are not exposed to the independent variable. In program evaluation, we usually call experimental groups project groups. So it's just a different word for the same thing. So instead of calling it an experimental group, it's a project group. So people in our project group will participate in this public program. Then control groups are usually referred to as comparison groups. So people in our comparison group will not participate in the program. So one of the most robust types of designs is what's called the classic experimental design, which you've run into before, I am sure, with the notation up there on the screen of ROXO, ROO. That stands for R is for random assignment. So it means that what we are doing here is we're going to randomly assign some people to be in the project group and randomly assign other people to be in the comparison group. And it's a random type of assignment. So it's being done completely randomly. Those who are randomly assigned to the project group will then be observed. We'll collect data on them on our dependent variable. They will then participate in the program, and then we'll collect data on the dependent variable again after they participate in the program. People in our comparison group will collect data on them before the program comes around. They will not participate in the program, and then we'll collect data from them again. So a pre-observation and a post-observation, the only difference between these two groups is that the project group participated in the program, the comparison group did not participate in the program. That's a robust design because by using random assignment, we can assure equivalency between our groups. So we can say that the project group is equivalent to the comparison group on every single variable, every single factor, with one exception. And that one exception is participation in the program. So participation in the program is the only thing that is different between our groups. And we see that the project group participants end up having a higher score on the dependent variable than our comparison group subjects. Then we can say that higher score is due entirely to participation in the program. That allows us to assert this type of causation, that the program is having this desired impact. I've listed up there for you some other types of experimental designs. Don't worry about that. You'll get into all those when you get to 696. For our purposes here, what we're really just kind of highlighting is the experimental design versus a second type of design known as the quasi-experimental design. The problem here with an experimental design for what we do in public program evaluation is that we oftentimes do not have the ability to randomly assign people to groups. So you think about a public program, especially if it's an entitlement-based program. That means that people are eligible, legally eligible, and entitled to get the benefits from this program. We cannot deny someone benefits to a program that they are legally entitled to. That would be illegal, that would be immoral, that would be unethical, it would be impractical. So oftentimes with our public programs, we are not able to randomly decide as with the researcher, as the evaluator, who gets to participate in the program and who does not get to participate in the program. People tend to self-select whether or not they individually want to participate in the program or not. So we oftentimes don't have the random assignment needed to be experimental in the type of design that we use. Since we cannot use random assignment, we cannot use an experimental design. So it's much more common in program evaluation for us to use quasi-experimental designs. So in a quasi-experimental design, we cannot use random assignment, which means we cannot say with confidence that, yes, our project group is equivalent to our comparison group. So instead, what we need to do is we need to create equivalency between our groups with the use of statistical analysis. So what we'll do is this is where we will create those control variables. So we'll say, okay, we'll create a demographic variable such as socioeconomic status. And socioeconomic status is an index variable that consists of someone's income level and someone's education level. So we'll measure the income and the education levels of everyone in our two groups, and we'll create this variable called socioeconomic status. We may want to create a variable for household size, and we'll use that as another control variable. We may want to create a variable for where they live in terms of what part of the city they live in. But we'll create control variables for all the variables that we think could affect our dependent variable, independent of participation in this program. That then allows us to say we now have equivalency between our two groups because we have control for all the important explanations for why our dependent variable has changed. That's what's known as a quasi-experimental design. So instead of creating equivalency through the use of design through random assignment, we're creating equivalency through the use of statistics and the development of control variables. One of the most common types of quasi-experimental designs that we tend to use in program evaluation is the longitudinal time series analysis. Longitudinal time series analysis, we're going to use something like that when we have variables that can change over time. If the values of our variables can change over time, we need to measure those variables over a longitudinal point in time. And so a lot of our program evaluations will collect data on our independent variables and our dependent variable over maybe a 5-year period or over a 10-year period in this longitudinal type of an approach. The longitudinal time series analysis is just one example of a very common type of quasi-experimental design that is used in program evaluation. But for the most part, we use quasi-experimental designs as opposed to experimental designs in evaluating public programs. Another step we have to go through in program evaluation is to construct our sample. We would be a wonderful world if we had the ability and the resources to collect our information from our entire population of beneficiaries of a program. If we had this ready-made way we could collect information from everybody, then we would be 100% accurate with our findings. We lack those resources and we lack that time. So instead of collecting our information from all the members of our population, we then collect our information from a subset of our population, as you know, what is called a sample. How we put our sample together, how we select people from the population to be part of our program evaluation, will depend upon what we are trying to accomplish with that program evaluation. If our goal of this program evaluation is to accurately generalize, extrapolate the results from our sample to our population, we're probably going to want to use the type of sampling design known as a probability sampling design. A probability sampling design uses random sampling. And the more random you are in how you pick people from your population to serve in your sample, the more accurate your sample results will be in comparison to the results you would have gotten from the population. So if you need to generalize, you'll want to use a probability type of sample. I've listed 4 different sampling probability types of sampling designs on the screen there for you. The most representative design that we could use is what's called a simple random sample. Simple random sampling is where we will take the list of our entire population. We will number that list called our sampling frame. We will number it and they number each case. And then we'll use a random number generator to then select which cases will then be selected to be part of our sample. Random sampling means that every case, every subject has an equal non-zero chance of being selected to be part of the sample. That's important. Equal non-zero chance. Everyone has to have a chance and their chance has to be equal. And you get that with simple random sampling. Sometimes, however, we do not have a ready-made sampling frame. We don't have a ready-made list of all of the people in the population that we are interested in. So we're looking at a program that benefits disabled veterans. We don't have a list necessarily of every disabled veteran that's out there. So what we have to do is we have to find a way to put together a sample that's representative of disabled veterans without having a list to pick from. That's something we can do in what's called systematic sampling. And you'll skip stratified for a second, go down to systematic sampling. In systematic sampling, what we do is we will use what's called a skip interval, and that we will select every certain number of cases, and then we will include those cases into our sample. So let me give you an example. Let's say that we have this local public health clinic. And this local public health clinic is providing services on an anonymous basis. What you want to do in your evaluation is you want to evaluate the effectiveness of the programs being implemented by this local health clinic. You don't know who's using the local health clinic because it's all done on an anonymous basis. So you do not have a list of people in your population. You do not have a sampling frame. So instead, what you may do as an evaluator is you may position yourself physically outside of that local health clinic. You will then wait till people come out of that local health clinic who have used the services, and you might select every 10th person who walks out the door, or every 20th person who walks out the door. Every nth person, whether it be the 10th person or the 20th person, that's what's called your skip interval. So if you use a skip interval of 10, you'll select every 10th person. A skip interval of 20, you'll select every 20th person. And then you'll interview that person and ask them about the services that they got and their satisfaction with the services they got from participation in that local health clinic. That's called systematic sampling. There is a random component to it, but it is not purely random, because if you're using a skip interval of 10, you're selecting every 10th person. That means by definition, person number 9 and person number 11 have an exactly 0% chance of being selected because they are not person number 10. So it's not random non-zero, but at least there is a random component to it because you are not determining who that 10th person is when they walk out the door. Stratified random sampling, which you kind of skipped over, we'll go back to that one. Stratified random sampling is a good approach to use if you have one variable or one factor or one characteristic that is of such overriding concern to you that you want to divide up, you want to stratify your sample according to that one characteristic. So for instance, if you want to look at a senior citizen living facility, and in the senior citizen living facility, they've had a problem with falls, that people are falling and getting hurt. And so they put together a program to try and help people in terms of the use of walkers or whatever it may be to help them to keep from falling, modifying steps and things such as that. And so they want to assess the effectiveness of that program. So what they will do is they will then say, well, the most interesting characteristic to us is whether or not one of the residents fell. So we're going to stratify our sample in terms of those residents who fell, those residents who did not fall. So you're going to stratify your sample according to whether or not the person fell. That's an example of stratified random sampling. Again, it's not purely random, but there's still a strong random component to it. The fourth one there on the screen is multi-stage cluster sampling. And this is something that the public sector is very much fond of in using in our program evaluations. Multi-stage cluster sampling is really useful if you do not have a sampling frame. You do not have a list of your population at the unit of analysis that you need for your program evaluation. So let's assume you want to do an evaluation of a program that benefits households. So you need a list of all the households in the state of California. You don't have a list of all the households in the state of California. So instead, what you'll do is use multi-stage cluster sampling. So you'll start at the county level. You'll say, we are going to randomly select a sample of counties. Then from each of those randomly selected counties, we are then going to randomly select a sample of cities. Then from each of those randomly selected cities, we are then going to randomly select neighborhoods. Then from that random sample of those neighborhoods, from each of those neighborhoods, we're going to select a random sample of streets. Then from each of those randomly sampled streets, we are then going to select a random sample of households. That's multi-stage cluster sampling. You are developing these randomly selected clusters at different stages. But what it helps you do is it then helps you put together a list of households that you can then collect data from. Multi-stage cluster sampling is used a lot by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's used a lot by the Census Bureau. When the Census Bureau is not doing its every 10-year enumeration of the population, it's using multi-stage cluster sampling. So those are examples of sampling designs where you construct your sample using random sampling, a probability type of design. And again, that is imperative if we want to generalize the results from our sample to our population. At times, we are not interested in generalizing our results to a larger population. We just kind of want to get a real quick snapshot of what a situation looks like. If that's the case, and we have very limited resources, we might opt for a non-probability type of sampling design where we do not use random sampling. So, for instance, I want to find out what MPA students think about the content of PPA 500. So I will ask all of you tonight. We're all sitting here together, so I'll ask you, what do you think about the content of PPA 500? That's what's called a convenient sample because you are very convenient to me. You're all sitting virtually in front of me in a Zoom session. So I will ask you those questions. Are you representative of the entire MPA population as a whole? Probably not. I don't know. I have no clue. So I can't generalize a convenient sample to a larger population. Snowballing is another non-probability technique that is very useful if you have a hard to reach population. So you think about a population such as residents who lack affordable housing. And so you have a homeless population. Homeless population, they're not going to have a verifiable address that you can send a survey to. They're not going to have a way to contact them. So you talk to one person in that population, ask them the questions on your questionnaire, however you're going to ask them the questions, then ask them to refer you to someone else who's in a similar situation. Interview that person, ask that person to refer you to someone else, and so on and so on. So as you get more and more referrals, the size of your sample will get bigger and bigger, hence the reason why it's referred to as a snowballing technique. Doesn't ensure that that sample is representative, but it's at least a way to get a snapshot so that we can get some information that we can use for our program evaluation. Then once we have our sample put together, we know where our data will be coming from. We then have to actually collect that data. One of the most common devices in data collection today is survey research. And in program evaluation, we have become very, very fond of using surveys. Cities use surveys all the time to assess citizen satisfaction with the programs that they are participating in. You will spend time in 696 talking about how to construct surveys. You'll talk about how to design questions, how to design response categories. You'll talk about scaling techniques. You'll talk about how to sequence questions on a survey. You'll talk about response rates that you get from different methods of delivery of your and dissemination of your survey. You'll talk about all that in 696. But for our purposes tonight, survey research is one of the major ways in which we collect data in public program evaluation. Another way we collect data is by using existing secondary data sets. So if the data already exists in an existing data set, we utilize those data sets. One approach that we can use with secondary data that has become very popular in program evaluation is the use of what's called a meta-analysis. And a meta-analysis is when we will go out there and collect multiple databases. We will then merge those databases, the data from those databases together into a new database by merging them all together into a new unique database. And we'll then apply statistical analysis techniques to that newly created database. That's known as a meta-analysis. Meta-analysis would be very useful in providing us with a wealth of data, very large data sets that we can work with, but we have to be very confident with how those data were collected in the first place. We have to trust how those evaluators and researchers collected their data for the data sets that we are using. But we essentially collect the data. After we collect the data, we then have to analyze that data. Today in program evaluation, that means the use of statistical analysis. The type of statistical analysis we use will depend upon our purpose. Are we merely doing a descriptive type of program evaluation in that we are just trying to take a snapshot of how many people are using this program and perhaps the characteristics and the demographics of people who are using this program? That's a very snapshot, descriptive type of program evaluation. That's where we use our descriptive statistics, mean, mode, median, standard deviation, all those good things. However, we oftentimes want to go well beyond that because we want to evaluate a program. So if we're going to truly evaluate a program, we have to go beyond just describing who's using the program. And so we'll move into something more associational in nature. Yeah, something more associational, we'll look at the relationship between participation in the program and another variable. And we'll oftentimes use things like measures of association. So this is where we use our, for ordinal data, our gammas and our summers, dyx's, and all those good measures of association. For interval data, we'll use our Pearson's R and our binary regression. What we're oftentimes more concerned about, though, in program evaluation is we want to know, is this program effective at achieving its goals? Is it effective at achieving its outcomes, which is causal in nature? So was the change in this intended outcome truly the result of participation in this program? When we're doing causal types of program evaluations, we're going to have to step our game up a little bit with our statistical analysis. This is where you get into multiple regression, OLS regression, binary logistic regression. We'll get into things like survival analysis, path analysis, Tobit, and there are a lot of other causal types of statistical methods that we will use in order to be able to accurately say that, yes, indeed, this program is achieving this intended goal. So statistical analysis is really very much a staple of program evaluation. Now, to allay some of your concerns, if you're not a huge fan of statistics, when you get to 697 and you're doing your research methods case study, the statistical section, you'll just have to say, which statistical analysis approach would you use and why? You don't have to actually calculate any statistics when you are doing your case study. So don't worry about that. In fact, even when you're in 696 in research methods, you're not going to do a whole lot of statistical calculations either. Because what we have done with 696 is we've kind of pulled out those statistical calculations, and we've done that through the use of prerequisites. So if you, before you can register for 696, you must demonstrate that you have an undergraduate statistics course that you've already completed, or you have to take the PPA 517 Analytical Skills Development course where you will cover statistical analysis before you get to 696 research methods. So even in 696, we deal with statistical analysis much more from a conceptual application perspective as opposed to calculations. Then obviously what we'll do is we'll take the results of our statistical analysis and we will then use those results to arrive at our conclusions. Our conclusions in terms of the effectiveness of the program. One would hope that if the result of our program evaluation tells us that this program is not effective at achieving its goals and objectives, that's information that will then be fed back into the program formulation process, perhaps eliminating this program or at least redesigning the program to make it work a little bit more effectively. We know that politics plays a role here, and that sometimes if a program has a lot of political support, even negative results from a program evaluation will not be enough to kill that program. We also know that program evaluation is not a very sexy topic in terms of getting appropriations and getting resources. Oftentimes when appropriators are looking at where they want to spend public money, they want to get the biggest political bang for their buck. And so program evaluation doesn't oftentimes give them those re-election types of benefits that they are looking for. So sometimes it's tough for us to shake money loose in order to do program evaluations. And so we probably don't evaluate our programs as thoroughly or as frequently as we probably should be doing. But at least it is one of those primary functions that we engage in as public administrators. Our goal as public administrators is to implement these programs in an effective manner so that they are achieving the goals, the stated goals in the enabling legislation that created those public programs. So it's imperative that we as public administrators know how to evaluate the effectiveness of the public programs that we are implementing. Which then really begs the question. We said that we hope that through our policy analysis, we can identify the effectiveness of our policies. We said through program evaluation, we hope that we'll be able to identify the effectiveness of our programs. Indeed, we know that we have a lot of values in addition to efficiency and effectiveness that we place an emphasis on in the public sector. But we still place a very strong emphasis on effectiveness. If we have a program or a policy or an organization that is not being effective, then we need to go back and redesign those in order to try and make them more effective. All these struggles at reforming the bureaucracy that we have seen over the past 200 years, whether it be things such as the Pendleton Act or the Reorganization Act from the Brownlow Commission, or the Hatch Act, or the Civil Service Reform Act, or you pick a Whistleblower Act. All these attempts at reforming the bureaucracy have been done for the purpose of trying to make the bureaucracy, trying to make public administration more effective. We talk a lot about effectiveness, but we haven't really done a good job defining effectiveness yet. For the most part, when we've talked about effectiveness over the past 2 class sessions, we have talked about it in terms of the ability to achieve goals. So a program or a policy or an organization is effective when it has the ability of achieving its stated goals. That's a very simple way of looking at effectiveness. That's a very common way of looking at effectiveness, but that's not the only way to define effectiveness in public administration. So this way, what I'd like to do is kind of add a little bit more nuance into our discussion of effectiveness by providing you with 4 different possible measures, 4 different models of how we can measure effectiveness. So the first model is what we call the goal attainment model. That's one we've been using up to this point in time. How well is the organization, the policy, or the program achieving its stated goals? But there are other ways to measure effectiveness as well. There's a model called the systems resource approach. There's a model called the participant satisfaction approach. And there's a model called the internal process approach. So let's look at how all 4 of those models define effectiveness. So starting with the most common, the simplest one, we have the goal attainment approach. It's a very simple one in that it's based upon this linkage between stated goals and effectiveness. If a program is achieving its stated goals, then we're saying that program or that policy is effective. If an organization is achieving its organizational goals, then we're going to say that public organization is being effective. It's a very, very simple, very linear, very straightforward way of looking at effectiveness. The shortcoming, the limitations with goal attainment approach is that the goal attainment approach, because it is simple, does not really consider a lot of complications. So you think about goals, just think about from an organizational perspective. So in the strategic planning process, our public organizations will identify their goals. They will identify long-term goals, and they'll also identify short-term goals. Those long-term goals are usually referred to as the official goals of the organization. Those official goals may be 5, 10-year goals down the line. Those are the long-term official goals. But in trying to achieve those official goals, organizations oftentimes will also establish what they refer to as operative goals. An operative goal is a short-term goal, maybe something we achieve in the next 6 to 10 months or 6 to 12 months. It's oftentimes a step toward achieving that long-term goal. However, when we have both sets of official as well as operative goals, sometimes those goals will come into conflict with each other. The goal attainment approach doesn't really help us very much when our goals conflict with each other. Because if we're achieving one goal, but it's detracting from another goal, are we truly being effective? So it doesn't really do a good job of identifying between these different types of goals. But it is still by far the most common way of measuring effectiveness. How well are we achieving our stated goals? And that's the goal attainment approach. A second approach, though, a second alternative is called the systems resource model. And the systems resource model is very much akin to the systems theory approach to organization theory. And last week we talked about the systems approach, especially open systems theory, whereby we're looking at the relationship between a public organization and its external environment. How does the organization affect the environment? How does the environment affect the organization? A systems resource approach will measure effectiveness as the organization's ability to exploit resources from its environment. So an organization or a policy or a program can be effective by pulling in new resources to help grow that organization or that program and help that organization or program survive into the future. So the measure of effectiveness is how well does the organization bring resources, new resources in from the environment? This idea known as last week negative entropy. That organizations don't just deteriorate and go out of existence, they bring new energies in from their external environment. The problem with the systems resource approach is sometimes it's relatively difficult to measure because at the same time that you're pulling resources in, you're also losing resources as well. So you have to look at the inflow as well as the outflow of resources from an organization. And you also have to do it over time. In that you basically have to look at the beginning when you start out your evaluation, you have to look at the resources the organization has at the beginning and then chart how those resources have changed over time. This is a useful approach to use when other indicators are difficult to measure. And so if you're struggling with goals and you have goals that seem to conflict with each other, so much so that it's difficult to use the goal attainment approach to effectiveness, you might want to use this systems resource approach and ask the question, how well is the organization exploiting resources from its environment as the indicator of effectiveness? A third model of effectiveness is called the participant satisfaction model. And in this model, we ask the question, how satisfied are our key stakeholders, our key strategic constituencies with what the organization or the policy or the program are providing? So how well is the organization keeping its key constituencies satisfied? Those key constituencies can be external to the organization, or they could also be internal as well. This is why the participant satisfaction model kind of bridges the gap between systems resource and then the fourth model we're going to talk about in a second, which is internal process. So your participants can be both outside as well as inside. When they are external to the organization, then it kind of bleeds over into systems resource because you are trying to keep them satisfied, oftentimes for the purpose of getting their support. And so there's kind of this bleeding over of the systems resource and participant satisfaction models. When you're looking internal to your organization, you're trying to keep your employees satisfied. So it kind of bleeds over to human relations and bleeds over into the internal process type of an approach. But in participant satisfaction, we define effectiveness according to the ability to satisfy our key strategic constituencies in our external and internal environments. We see cities do this all the time. Cities are very fond of sending out their citizen satisfaction surveys, where they will ask their citizens how satisfied they are with the services that they are receiving from the city. That's a perfect example of a participant satisfaction model. If you're getting 95, 96% citizen satisfaction scores, the city is going to say, we are being effective in the services and programs that we are providing to our citizens. We use this approach in accreditation in the MPA program. We send out a survey every couple of years asking students as well as alums how satisfied they are with their time in the MPA program. We ask them how likely they are to recommend the MPA program to colleagues and friends and family. And typically we're around about the 97 or 98% satisfaction rating. And that's very high for an MPA program. That's unusually high, which is obviously a good indicator of program effectiveness. So that's the participant satisfaction model. And then the fourth model of effectiveness is the internal process model. In the internal process model, we look within an organization or a policy or a program, and we look at indicators of organizational health. Things such as a strong organization culture, a positive work climate, esprit de corps, this feeling of team spirit among the members of the organization, group loyalty, how well they work in teams together, the amount of confidence, trust, and communication you have between workers and management and leadership, a la Mary Parker Follett type of argument. Where decision making is made, is decision making made near information sources, whereby you can have people at lower levels of your organization participating in decision making because they are the ones who have access to that type of information. That's an indicator of organizational health. The sharing of facts and feelings, horizontal and vertical sharing of these facts and feelings. Again, kind of that Mary Parker Follett participative type of management approach. Rewards to managers for performance, growth, and development of subordinates and for creating effective working groups. Another indicator of organizational health. Interaction between the organization and its parts, where conflicts that occur over projects are resolved in the interest of the organization. How does the organization deal with conflict? How does the organization resolve conflict? Is it being resolved primarily through domination, through compromise, or through integration? So you look for these indicators of organizational health. If you want to look at it through a systems theory type of lens, you're looking at organizational health as that point of homeostasis, that point of balance within the organization where everyone is working together in this symbiotic type of relationship. If you have those types of internal processes within an organization, that would then lead you to argue that the organization is effective. So as you can see, those are four different ways of measuring effectiveness of not only public organizations, but also times as well of public policies and public programs. So when we say we're evaluating effectiveness, I think we have to be very careful in terms of how we define that effectiveness. Effective at what? Effective at achieving goals, effective at enhancing our resources, effective at keeping our stakeholders and key constituencies happy, effective at creating supportive internal processes and relationships within our organization to then help the organization be effective. And so I think those are four different ways we look at effectiveness. And I think it's an important nuanced way of looking at effectiveness, because at the end of the day, when we develop our theories, when we make changes to our public organizations, we are oftentimes doing it for the stated purpose of making public administration and making government more effective. So to truly make it more effective, we have to first know what we mean by effectiveness. So are there any questions on those four models of effectiveness? Because you're going to be using those models on your final assessment, or any questions about program evaluation and just kind of this foreshadowing of information before you get to your PPA 696 research methods course? Any initial questions or clarifications on any of this information up to this date? Okay. If not, then it is 5:15, so I would recommend that we take a break. That will help me catch my breath a little bit and help you to also keep your sanity from having to listen to me so much. But let's go ahead and take a break. It's 5:15. Let's say take a 15-minute break. Come on back at 5:30. And when we come back at 5:30, then we will get into a discussion of the development of employment in the federal level as kind of a prelude into our discussion next week of the function of managing human resources. So we'll get into that information when we come back in 15 minutes. So have a good break. See you in 15. All right, well, welcome back. We are back from break, so let's go ahead and get into our discussion of what I like to think is kind of a prelude to managing human resources, which is to kind of set up our system of career civil service and the bureaucracy and how that system of career civil service came about, and then how it has evolved and changed since the late 1800s. So let's talk about that information. We're also going to talk a bit about the importance of unionization and what unionization has meant for the public sector. And I think that's probably what we'll call it quits for the night after that information. They'll then set us up really well then for next Tuesday, when we'll spend the first half of class talking about managing human resources, and then the second half of class talking about managing fiscal resources. And that should then wrap up all the information then for the course. And again, it's important that we wrap up the information next week because you do have your final assessment due the week after that. And so I want to make sure we get through all of our information that you will need to then do a good job on the final assessment. So let me turn off the camera to save bandwidth, and we will have at it. So in terms of public employment and civil service, we have not always had a civil service system. And we haven't always hired people based upon their qualification, based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities. With the founding of the nation in the late 1700s up until the 1820s, we hired people in what was called the era of gentlemen based upon who they were as opposed to what they knew. So we were hiring people who were considered to be from the upper echelon of society. So we are hiring people who are considered to be quote unquote gentlemen. And again, at this point in time, in order to work in the federal bureaucracy, you had to be white, you had to be male, and you had to come from the best educational and societal and family backgrounds. The reason why people were being hired in this era of gentlemen based upon who they were was essentially to try and add some legitimacy to the national government. When you think about what was going on, especially in the early 1800s, you had the War of 1812. In 1814, you had the British that marched into Washington, D.C., and literally burned the Capitol. When you had Americans watching their Capitol burn, they were embarrassed, and they were also very concerned that maybe this new government was not going to be around for very much longer. So it was important to have these respectable people who were in these positions in the government in order to reassure the people about the work being done in government. So we hired people in the era of gentlemen based upon who they were. Then, if you know your history, you know that in the election of 1824, we had this situation that came to be known as the corrupt bargain. And the presidential election of 1824, we have multiple candidates who were running for the White House. Three of the primary candidates running were Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and Henry Clay. Because you had so many people running, it helped to split the vote. And so Andrew Jackson won more popular votes, a plurality of popular votes, but more popular votes than any of the other candidates. Andrew Jackson also won more electoral college votes than the other candidates as well. The problem was that Jackson did not win a majority of the Electoral College votes. And we know to become president, you have to win a majority of the Electoral College. So since no one won a majority of the Electoral College votes, according to the Constitution, the presidential election then goes into the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives then selects the president, with each congressional delegation having one vote. So when the election went in the House of Representatives, you had this purported deal that occurred between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, in which if Henry Clay got his supporters in the House of Representatives to switch their support to John Quincy Adams, once John Quincy Adams was then appointed president, John Quincy Adams would then appoint Henry Clay to a cabinet position, specifically Secretary of State. So this was the purported deal, the alleged deal between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. Sure enough, the supporters who were supporting Henry Clay shifted their support to John Quincy Adams. That was enough to give John Quincy Adams the majority of congressional delegations. John Quincy Adams was then elected president by the House of Representatives. Once he was inaugurated and was setting up his cabinet, he then offered a cabinet position, Secretary of State, to Henry Clay. Hence the reason why the elections come to be known as the corrupt bargain. Obviously, Andrew Jackson was outraged at this arrangement in that he had won more popular and more electoral votes, but was still denied the presidency. Ran again for the presidency against John Quincy Adams in 1828 and trounced him. And so Andrew Jackson won the presidency in his own right in 1828, won the Electoral College vote. And when Andrew Jackson comes into the White House, he ushers in a new era of public employment known as the era of spoils or the era of patronage. In the era of spoils, you got a job in government not based upon who you were, but based upon who you knew. So you got your job in government based upon supporting the winning political party, supporting the winning candidate. The old adage in the era of spoils was, to the victor go the spoils. That the political party that won the day then could take these offices, these vacancies, and they could then offer up these jobs to the people who supported them and help them get elected. We saw this era of spoils running through until the late 1800s. We had talked earlier, when we talked about accountability and ethics, about the political machines in our major cities. Those were all part of this era of spoils. We had a lot of corruption. We had a lot of incompetence, a lot of misfeasance and malfeasance going on. So much so that people really started to get concerned about the effectiveness of government in the era of spoils. And there were some real conversations that were starting to happen, especially at the municipal level, about the need to have competent experts in these positions in government. There is a gentleman in the House of Representatives by the name of Pendleton, and you see his picture there on the screen, who for many years carried with him draft legislation that would introduce a career civil service system into America. The problem is that he was struggling to get support for that legislation. All of that changed in 1881 with the assassination of President Garfield. President Garfield, after he was inaugurated in 1881. Several months later, he was then assassinated by an assassin by the name of Charles J. Guiteau. Charles J. Guiteau had written some speeches for Garfield when he was a candidate. There's no evidence that Garfield ever read any of these speeches, let alone used any of the speeches. There's really very scant evidence that he really knew Charles J. Guiteau at all. But Guiteau felt that he helped Garfield get elected to the presidency. And it's the era of spoils after all. And so therefore, he deserved an appointment in the Garfield administration. And the appointment he wanted, the primary appointment he wanted, was ambassador to France. Obviously, he got no appointment. So Guiteau thought, in his relatively irrational thought process, that if he assassinated President Garfield, then President Garfield's vice president was Chester Arthur. Chester Arthur would ascend to the presidency, and Chester Arthur was a big believer in the system of patronage. He was a big believer in political parties, and so therefore Chester Arthur would then be grateful, and Chester Arthur would then provide a position to Charles J. Guiteau. Guiteau assassinates Garfield, and instead of getting a position in the Arthur administration, Guiteau instead was executed. And so this was this triggering event where it really galvanized public opinion around the fact that we need to move away from this patronage approach and we need to move more toward hiring people based upon their qualifications, hiring these objective experts as opposed to hiring people who are directly aligned with candidates and political parties. So that then gave the momentum for Pendleton to introduce this Pendleton Act. It ended up getting passed and signed by the president in 1883. So in 1883, we get this Pendleton Act that introduces career civil service into America. So now people get their jobs based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities, and they are protected from political reprisals and from political discipline. So you could not lose your job in government because you didn't support the right candidate or the right political party. You got your job and you kept your job based upon your expertise, based upon your performance in that position. So that introduces us into the era of merit, getting your job based upon knowledge, skills, and abilities. And that's where our career civil service system that we have today originally came from. Now, we didn't create career civil service in 1883 with the Pendleton Act. As Woodrow Wilson tells us, we borrowed it from other nations like England. And we borrowed some of their career civil service innovations and then applied them to our country to make them fit our unique political culture. But we have our own American version of career civil service. So that begins in 1883. One of the problems of the Pendleton Act, though, is that the Pendleton Act provided protection to bureaucrats from political interference. However, it didn't ask a lot back in return from those bureaucrats. So even though you're being protected from political influence, you were still allowed to practice politics while you were working in the federal bureaucracy. And that was a problem. So then in 1939, we ended up getting this thing called the Hatch Act. And the Hatch Act requires that federal employees, while they're on the job, cannot engage in campaigning, cannot engage in political types of activities. Federal employees cannot use their offices and public resources and public time for the purpose of campaigning for a candidate or a political party. So it was really meant to try and pull politics out of the everyday activities of those individual bureaucrats. So it placed some political limitations upon these public administrators. Soon after the adoption of the Hatch Act at the federal level, we saw states adopt their own little Hatch Acts. And so every state adopted their own little Hatch Act to again try and separate out politics from the administrative work of public administrators. So fast forward then to 1978. So we get to 1978, we are almost 100 years removed from the passage of the Pendleton Act. During that intervening period of time, we had little pieces of piecemeal legislation being added on and changing the Pendleton Act here and there, so that we kind of have this whole patchwork, this hodgepodge of civil service regulations that were very confusing. And so many regulations that federal bureaucrats really didn't understand what they could do and what they could not do legally. So we decided in the 1970s to reform civil service by making it a little bit clearer and a little bit easier to understand what public administrators could do and what they could not do. We got that in 1978 in this big overhaul, this big reform known as the Civil Service Reform Act. So the Civil Service Reform Act creates our modern system of career civil service. And the purpose, again, was to try and clear up a lot of the ambiguity and a lot of the confusing laws that had been added on to the Pendleton Act since it was originally passed back in 1883. And it's way beyond the scope of this course to get into all the aspects of the Civil Service Reform Act, but to just kind of give you a flavor of how the act really fundamentally changed career civil service. I've listed on the screen for you 5 different organizations that came out of the Civil Service Reform Act that were meant to try and help foster and help protect civil service regulations. One of those, the first one that you see on the screen, is OPM. And OPM stands for the Office of Personnel Management. Office of Personnel Management was created to be the central clearinghouse for the human resource function at the federal level of the bureaucracy. The Office of Personnel Management was there to help agencies identify vacancies, to put together position vacancy notices, to put together examinations, to test people who applied for the jobs, to score the examinations. OPM would then, after they score the examinations, would then put together an eligibility list, what was known as the rule of three or the rule of five. So they put together an eligibility list of the top three or the top five scores on those exams. That eligibility list would then be given to a federal department or agency. The agency could then interview people only off of that eligibility list. So those people who OPM put on the eligibility list, those are the only people who are eligible to be hired to fill those vacancies. OPM is still with us today. It doesn't serve the exact same function in that we have really decentralized the hiring process at the federal level. So everything doesn't run through OPM anymore. We don't have the reliance on examinations we used to have, and we rely more on a more holistic review of somebody's knowledge, skills, and abilities as represented by their resume and their education, their experience, their references. So we take more of a holistic view of candidates rather than their score on a specific examination. But OPM still provides support to agencies for the staffing, the personnel function. OPM is still that central clearinghouse for human resources. OPM was placed within the executive office of the president because it is very much of this management type of agency. Then the second agency was created is known as the Merit Systems Protection Board, or MSPB. The Merit Systems Protection Board was there to do just what it says, to protect merit principles. And what would happen is if you were a federal employee and you felt that your civil service merit principles were being violated, that you were being disciplined because your supervisor didn't like you, or because your supervisor was a Democrat and you were a Republican, you could then say, my civil service protections are being violated, and then take your claim to the Merit Systems Protection Board. The Merit Systems Protection Board would then review your claim, they would investigate your claim, they would hold a hearing on your claim, and then they would render a decision. So if the Merit System Protection Board found that, yes, indeed, you were demoted and you were demoted in violation of career civil service principles, you would then be returned to your original position and you would then get back pay for that original position. So they would actually take corrective action to correct those violations. Another organization that was created is the OSC, the Office of Special Counsel. And the Office of Special Counsel was originally created as part of the Merit Systems Protection Board. So it was within the Merit Systems Protection Board. And the purpose of the OSC was to be a place for whistleblowers to go. So if you saw someone else's career civil service protections being violated, not yours, but someone else's protections being violated, you could then blow the whistle to the Office of Special Counsel. Office of Special Counsel would then investigate your claim, would hold a hearing on your claim, and would render a decision. The problem was the Office of Special Counsel, because it was part of the Merit System Protection Board, didn't have its own staff and did not have its own budget. So it was lacking resources, so much so that it had a massive backlog of cases that it just wasn't able to get to. So in 1989, with the Whistleblowers Act, which we had talked about when we talked about accountability and ethics, the Whistleblowers Act pulls the Office of Special Counsel out of the Merit Systems Protection Board and makes it its own independent agency with its own staff and its own budget to help redress some of that backlog of cases. So again, to kind of clarify the difference with the Merit System Protection Board, that's where you would go if your career civil service protection is being violated. If you saw someone else's protections being violated, you would then blow the whistle to the Office of Special Counsel. So now we've got a little bit of rhyme and reason for these federal bureaucrats in terms of what they can do if they feel that their civil service protections are being violated. Then the fourth organization you see there is the FLRA, the Federal Labor Relations Authority. And the Federal Labor Relations Authority is kind of the corollary organization to the National Labor Relations Board in the private sector. So the Federal Labor Relations Authority is in charge of collective bargaining and the negotiations process in the public sector. And it's in charge of collective bargaining for essentially the entire federal public sector, with the exception of organizations such as the U.S. Postal Service. Negotiations that go on in collective bargaining for the Postal Service, those are under the auspices of the National Labor Relations Board, as opposed to the Federal Labor Relations Authority. And that's because the U.S. Postal Service, as we've talked about before, is a government corporation. As a government corporation, it acts a lot more like a private company than it does a public agency. But the purpose of the Federal Labor Relations Authority is to make sure that in collective bargaining and in relationships between unions and management, that both parties are essentially playing fair. And so what one party can do is, if one party thinks the other party is not playing fair, they can file a grievance with the Federal Labor Relations Authority. They can file what's called an unfair labor practice, or a ULP. The Federal Labor Relations Authority will then investigate that unfair labor practice, and they will render a decision about what to do about that unfair labor practice. The FLRA got off on a really bad foot, if you will, with federal. And that's because in the early part of the Reagan administration, air traffic controllers decided they were going to go on strike for additional compensation and better working conditions. President Reagan said, if you go on strike, I will fire you, because air traffic controllers have a direct impact upon public safety. Many air traffic controllers in 1981 went on strike anyway, and President Reagan fired them. Obviously, the air traffic controllers went to the Federal Labor Relations Authority. They said, this is an unfair labor practice. We are allowed to take a work action like a strike as part of the collective bargaining process. The Federal Labor Relations Authority sided with the Reagan administration. The FLRA said, this is a job, air traffic controller, that has a direct impact upon public safety. And the impact upon public safety is so direct and so pervasive and so important that we're going to side with the Reagan administration, that public safety wins out over the ability and the right to strike. That had a really chilling effect with a lot of public employee unions whenever they had to have future contact with the FLRA. And the FLRA really had kind of this reputation of supporting administration as opposed to supporting public employee unions. And they worked really hard over the next couple of decades to try and get out of that type of position with those public employee unions. Then the last one you see on the screen is the SES. That stands for the Senior Executive Service. We recognized we had a fundamental problem in our modern system of civil service. The vast majority of bureaucrats who worked within our agencies and departments were career civil servants. They had career civil service protections. However, at the very top of our organizations, those organizations are being led by political appointees, people who are appointed by the president, and in some, but not all, but in some situations, were then confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Political appointees, because they are appointed by the president, are not career civil servants, they are executive officials, which means that they oftentimes follow the policy desires of the White House, of the president. So what you oftentimes had going on is you have these political appointees who are trying to take the department in one direction, and then the vast majority of people who work in that department as career civil servants trying to go into another direction. So those career civil servants would say, well, this political appointee, this person's going to be there for maybe 18, 24 months, and then they're going to be gone, and there'll be another political appointee there. So if I don't like what they're telling me to do, and I disagree with how they're taking the direction they're taking the agency, I'll just wait them out, because I'm here for 20, 30, 40 years. I'm here for a career. So you have this fundamental disconnect between the upper levels of leadership in the organization and the rest of the organization. So to try and rectify that, we created this thing called the Senior Executive Service. And so to explain the Senior Executive Service a little bit better, we'll go to this next slide, because I think it's, you kind of need a little bit of background information on the federal bureaucracy. So the federal bureaucracy, the federal civil service, is predicated upon this thing called the general schedule. The general schedule is a position classification system whereby we can classify positions for the purpose of compensation based upon the content and the supervisory responsibilities of those specific positions. So every position gets its own grade level, goes into a grade level, and it has a pay band that assigns compensation based upon the grade level of that position. So in the general schedule, technically, before the Civil Service Reform Act, the general schedule ran from a GS1 up to the high of a GS18. In order to try and bridge the gap between career civil servants and political appointees, the senior executive service took GS 16, 17, and 18 members, people who were at those highest levels of the career civil servants, GS 16, 17, and 18, pulled them out of the career civil service and placed them into this new service known as the senior executive service. If you became part of this new senior executive service, you would be given bonus pay, or at least you were promised bonus pay if your organization is doing a good job achieving its goals. So the better your organization performs, the more you will be then eligible for this bonus pay. Also, if you're a part of the senior executive service, you also get a lot more flexibility in terms of your appointments. So if you tire of working in one agency and you want to transfer to another agency, that was something that was very easy to do in the senior executive service. So the benefits are you're promised bonus pay, you're promised more flexibility in your career. The downside is when you join the senior executive service, you give up your careers, many of your career civil service protections. So it becomes easier to discipline and to terminate a member of the senior executive service. The problem with the senior executive service is a lot of that bonus pay that was promised by Congress never even materialized. If you think about the status of the federal budget in the late 1970s and throughout the 80s and 90s, we were running budget deficits every single year in that our expenditures were exceeding our revenue. So therefore, we had to make cuts. And so one of the areas where cuts were made was to this promise of bonus pay. So a lot of those senior executive service members became very disenchanted and very disaffected with the senior executive service. But by pulling the 16, 17, and 18 level employees out and putting them into the senior executive service, what you're doing is you're kind of creating this middle ground between your political appointees and the vast majority of the rest of your organization who are career civil servants, GS 15 and below. In the senior executive service, that's then be called executive service, and the levels are ES1 through ES5, ES standing for executive service. So that was the idea behind this senior executive service, to kind of bridge the gap between political appointees and career civil servants. Now, functionally today, the way in which the general schedule works in modern federal civil service is that really kind of the lowest position you can have is a GS3 or GS4. GS3 or GS4 positions are typically going to be internships, student jobs. Those are your GS3 and GS4 types of positions, very much temporary types of positions. Your entry-level, permanent, full-time entry-level positions in the federal bureaucracy are going to be at the GS5 to GS7 level. Those are most of your entry-level positions. Mid-level management positions are then GS8 to GS12, and then your top-level supervisory positions are GS13 to GS15. So the career civil service now stops at the GS15 level, and then what used to be 16, 17, and 18 are now part of the senior executive service. Yeah, go ahead. Thank you. Do you have a question?
Yes, sir. So what kind of organizations hire or are civil service employees a part of?
They're spread across the entire federal bureaucracy. And so career civil servants populate the vast majority, probably upwards of 90 to 95% of the positions across all of our federal agencies, all of our federal departments. So Department of Agriculture, Department of Veterans Affairs, the Environmental Protection Agency, you name it. So all of our federal agencies, federal departments, they are primarily staffed with career civil servants. And so the general schedule looks a lot different today than it did before the Civil Service Reform Act. And if you are entering into the federal civil service, the federal bureaucracy with an MPA degree, so say you finish your degree in a couple of years and you want to go and work in Washington, D.C. for the federal government, you would probably enter into the federal bureaucracy somewhere around a GS 11 or GS 12 type of position. One of the really nice things about federal work is that the federal government will oftentimes allow education to suffice for experience requirements. And so if a position says 5 to 7 years experience, an MPA degree may be able to count toward, 3 to 5 years of that experience. And so you're probably going to go in about a GS 11, GS 12 type of position. Once you get to a GS 13 to GS 15 position, one of these top level supervisory positions, you can then apply for the Executive Service Academy. If you want to join the Senior Executive Service, you would first have to attend and complete a course of study with the Executive Service Academy. Once you complete that academy, then you will be eligible for moving into the Senior Executive Service if you so chose. Again, the advantage of the general schedule in this position classification system is that it allows for fair treatment of employees, especially when it comes to compensation. So positions that are more supervisory in nature, positions that require more experience and more education, those are the positions that will be compensated at a higher level than positions that don't have those same types of requirements. And that's the primary advantage of a position classification system. The disadvantage of a position classification system is sometimes you can kind of get locked into a grade level and a pay band and not really have any place to go. And so you'll say, for instance, you are in a GS 12 type of position and you've been working there for 20 years, so you're in the highest pay band of that GS 12 position. Other than just a yearly cost of living adjustment that Congress may want to give to federal bureaucrats, there's not a whole lot of opportunity for additional income, for additional compensation. In order to get additional compensation, you would have to get your position reclassified from a GS 12 into a GS 13. So you'd have to request a reclassification study. Reclassification studies, not just at the federal level, but the state and local level, are very lengthy processes. And so what will happen to reclassification study is that you will have someone from HR will come and probably shadow you and see what you are doing on a daily basis and see how the nature of your job has changed. Unless there's empirical evidence that the nature of your job has changed and has become more difficult or more challenging than it was at the GS 12 level, your position probably won't be reclassified. But if you can reclassify from a GS 12 to a GS 13, the GS 13 position would then carry enhanced compensation. But that's one of the disadvantages of position classification systems is people sometimes get kind of locked in to one grade level and one pay band and not really be able to move up unless they get their position reclassified or apply for a new position that's at a higher type of grade level. But that's kind of what the career civil service system looks like at the federal level. All state governments have their own state career civil service systems as well. They won't necessarily use the general schedule approach, but career civil service is really the dominant approach to how we hire people to work in public administration. Vast majority of public administrators are in the career civil service. So, as members of the career civil service, it means that these employees have protections that are afforded to them from government code in terms of being protected from arbitrary, capricious, and prejudicial dismissal, being protected from dismissal on the basis of politics, and your evaluation of your performance is going to be based upon your performance in the job. So, you've got those types of career civil service protections. You're not an at will employee like we see over in the private sector. However, in addition to those protections that you get from the career civil service, you also will get some protections afforded to you from your collective bargaining agreement if you are a unionized employee. Unionization is far more prevalent in the public sector as compared to the private sector. And I think I may have mentioned it in this class before, but in the private sector, about 11 or 12% of private sector employees are part of employee unions. In the public sector, it jumps up to about 32 or 33%. So almost a third of employees are part of public sector employee unions. Those public sector employee unions then engage in the process of collective bargaining with management. And so through this collective bargaining process, we'll determine things such as compensation increases, we'll determine things such as conditions of work, we'll determine things such as evaluation procedures, eligibility for professional development, protections against discipline and termination from a position. All those types of things will be involved in that collective bargaining agreement, oftentimes referred to as the contract. And to give you an example of how detailed these contracts can be, I believe the California Faculty Association, which is a public employee union, I believe that contract has, I want to say, 41 different articles to it, each article dealing with a different topic. And so it's a very, very lengthy type of document. So that collective bargaining agreement, that contract, will then provide protections for those employees. And you'll provide protections for employees in the organization, not necessarily just those who belong to the union. So you will be protected by the collective bargaining agreement, even if you are not part of the union, a member of the union, even if you are not paying dues to the union, you are still covered under that collective bargaining agreement. Now, collective bargaining operates differently depending upon which government you are dealing with. And so at the federal level, in collective bargaining at the federal level, there's a much more limited scope of bargaining at the federal level. And when we say scope of bargaining, we're talking about the types of issues that can be negotiated, the types of issues that can be collectively bargained over. And I'll give you an example. Typically, at the federal level, compensation increases are not considered within the scope, permissive scope of bargaining, meaning that they cannot be part of the collective bargaining process. Now, at the state or local level, that sounds weird to us because at the state and local level, probably the primary issue that gets negotiated is going to be compensation. But it's different at the federal level because federal employee compensation is established by the US Congress. So only Congress has the ability to change compensation for federal employees. And we have this thing called I always get the name wrong, but it's essentially a compensation commission, commission on compensation. And that compensation commission has the responsibility of recommending to Congress changes in compensation for federal employees. I had a former colleague of mine from NASPA who is on faculty at BYU. He was appointed by President Obama to the Compensation Commission and worked on that commission for several years, meeting a couple times a year to put together these recommendations to give to Congress. But only Congress can determine compensation. So compensation is outside of the permissive scope of bargaining at the federal level for collective bargaining. But at the state and local level, for the vast majority of states, it is within the permissive scope of bargaining, and it's oftentimes the primary topic that is negotiated over. So depending upon states, some states have a very permissive scope of bargaining, some have a very restricted scope of bargaining. California has a relatively permissive scope of bargaining. Other states such as Mississippi and Alabama have some very restrictive scopes of bargaining. So scope of bargaining is the types of issues that you can collectively bargain over. So you go through this collective bargaining process for the purpose of coming up with a collective bargaining agreement, coming up with a contract. That's a difficult process because even though we don't want it to be an adversarial process, usually the union, the bargaining unit for the union comes into it with the primary goal of getting more compensation and better work conditions. Management usually comes into it with the primary goal of trying to save money and in trying to reduce its expenditures. And so because you have both parties coming oftentimes from adversarial positions, it's not unusual to see an impasse. An impasse is declared when the two sides are unable to come to an agreement on a collective bargaining agreement. We saw that impasse being declared here in the Cal State system with the Cal State University and the CFA declared an impasse. The CFA declared an impasse. We then saw a very quick, very short strike that I guess lasted about half a day. And then there was a negotiated settlement that was ratified by the membership of CFA. But sometimes it's not that easy to get through an impasse. And so there are some impasse resolution strategies that we can use to try and kind of break an impasse and to try and get agreement on a contract. Three of the primary impasse resolution strategies we see used in the public sector are fact-finding, mediation, and arbitration. Now, fact-finding is something that was done in the recent impasse between CFA and the CSU. They brought in an independent fact finder. That fact finder would then look at the bargaining proposals and collect information from both the union as well as management, and then put together a fact finder's report. That fact finder report does not recommend a solution, does not pick a solution, but instead it just is supposed to be an objective, benign um, telling of the facts. You know, this is what's going on in this impasse. This is what the two parties, their positions are. Very much of a fact finding, objective, benign type of report. Once that fact finder report is done, it is then provided to the union and provided to management. It is then also embargoed for a 2-week period of time, meaning that only union and only management can see that fact finder report. And within the union, only the bargaining unit and the heads of the union can see the fact finding report. Only the bargaining participants and upper level management can see that fact finding report for the agency, but it's not given to the media. It's not given to the public. It's embargoed for a 2-week period of time. The reason for the embargo is to give both parties a chance to read the report, and then hopefully the report will then move the parties toward an agreement. If the fact finding report makes the union look really bad, the union will then have a motivation to settle. If management is looking really bad in that fact finding report, then they will probably want to settle before that report goes public. But in fact finding, you're not guaranteeing that you're going to end up getting a resolution. So fact finding doesn't always work. Another approach is mediation. And in mediation, you would bring in a certified, trained mediator to come in and sit down with the two parties and try and hammer out an agreement. When I was in college, I had a political science professor who was a member of what's called the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. And the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service has trained mediators that they then send out to all these places all over the country where there are impasses that are occurring. And so one of the good things about being a student in his class is we rarely had class because over half the classes were canceled because he was jetting all over the country to do his mediation. But these trained mediators sit down with both sides and try and hammer out an agreement. A third approach is arbitration. In arbitration, you bring in a third party arbiter. And if you really want to get an agreement, if you really want to get a collective bargaining agreement in place, there's a type of arbitration that is known as binding final offer arbitration. And in binding final offer arbitration, an arbiter will come in and will say, union, give me your final offer. Management, give me your final offer. We'll then compare those two proposals and we'll select one. The proposal that is selected by the arbiter in binding final offer arbitration, that then becomes the collective bargaining agreement. That then becomes the contract. So binding final offer arbitration, the good thing about it is you are guaranteed to get an agreement and it's guaranteed to break an impasse. The disadvantage is it's dangerous because if you are management and the arbiter picks the union's proposal, you're going to be pretty hard up because that means you're going to be giving the union everything that it asked for or vice versa. But that's one way you can be sure that you are going to get a resolution to this impasse. Labor relations have become pretty fraught in recent years between union bargaining units and management. So much so that we have tried a lot of things to try and make the process a little less adversarial. One of the things we see used is what's called interest-based bargaining or IBB. And if you're interested in some of these aspects of collective bargaining, we have a course in the program, PPA 570, Negotiating Dynamics. We also have a course, PPA 577, Employee-Employer Relations. Both of those courses will really get into the granular details about strategies of negotiation and then a lot of these impasse resolution procedures and different approaches to bargaining. So if you're interested in bargaining negotiations, 570 and 575 are going to be great classes that you can consider taking as electives in the MPA program. But in interest-based bargaining is supposed to try and find a shared interest between bargaining unit and management And so if you focus on that shared interest, that should help you better come to an agreement. A lot of organizations are engaging in what they call their labor management initiatives, and that's very common in many organizations as well. In a labor management initiative or an LMI, what you will do is you will have a lot of team building types of, if I could type, sorry about that, I'm trying to type and talk. You have a lot of team building types of activities. You'll have a lot of things done away from the bargaining table where you allow your representatives of your bargaining unit and representatives of management to get together and learn about each other and get to know each other outside of the confines of the negotiating table. So that by doing that, once they do get together at the table, it builds a lot of trust. And by building that trust, you're better able to come to negotiated settlements. The big so what question, because I'm huge on that so what question, is well, so what? So we have this unionization, so we have these collective bargaining agreements. What does that mean for us as public administrators? As a career civil servant in a non-leadership position, it's going to mean that we have an additional layer of protections. Not only do we have career civil service protections, we have all these protections coming to us in the form of the collective bargaining agreement. If you are in a management position, it means that when you are managing human resources, you not only need to be aware of career civil service protections, but also you need to be intimately aware with all the details in that collective bargaining agreement as well. What this has meant is it's meant that managing human resources has become much more complex than it used to be in the past. How much so that a lot of organizations have tried to centralize the human resource management function within HR offices. And they've decided, let's let HR professionals, people who are professionals in the field, handle this human resource management instead of having our line managers deal with it, because there are just so many rules and regulations and provisions. Line managers cannot know all those provisions in addition to what they're supposed to do on a daily basis, as well as a human resource professional. So when it's led to this centralization of the human resource function within offices of human resource, it's meant that there has been kind of this cottage industry that has emerged for human resource professionals. And the size of these HR offices have grown. A lot of HR offices are now contracting with human resource professionals who are independent contractors to then help these organizations deal with these very complex human resource management functions. But it means that the management of human resources has become a very complex and very difficult function of public administrators. Which then leads us to, well, what are these human resource management functions? What do we do on a daily basis as public administrators in managing our human resources? Because after all, 85 to 90% of our public budget, 85 to 90% of the money that we spend as an organization will go toward personnel. It will go toward our human resources in the form of salaries, in the form of benefits, in the form of training and professional development. That's a huge percentage of our budget, which means that learning how to manage human resources is an essential skill for all leaders and managers in the public sector to have. And that's what we are going to start talking about when we get together again the next Tuesday. First half of class, we'll talk about all these different functions in the human resource management process. I'll take you through a discussion of recruitment, uh, selection, allocation, evaluation, and sanctioning and discipline, the major functions in human resource management. We'll do all that in the first half of class. And then in the second half, we'll turn our attention to our final topic, which will be the management of fiscal resources. We'll talk about different types of budgets. We'll talk about operating versus capital budgets. We'll talk about the purpose of a budget. We'll talk about revenues and expenditures, and we'll talk about how governments pay for things, how they pay for their everyday operations as opposed to how they pay for long-term capital projects like buildings and vehicles and all those high price tag items that every government needs to purchase. So we'll stop here for now. And then again, next week, we'll get into the discrete functions of human resource management. Just one last reminder is by midnight tonight, you have to have Canvas essay number 4 done. And then you also have to have your midterm assessment turned in as well. Then for next Tuesday by midnight, you'll then have to have Canvas essay number 5 completed. And then the final assessment will then be due by midnight on March the 12th. So 2 weeks left, and this class is then over and finished. Questions, comments, clarifications needed? I know I've talked a lot again tonight, but I just want to really make sure we get through the information that you need in order to do a good job on the final assessment. So any questions? Okay. Then I'll give you back a few minutes tonight. You'll get out a little bit early. Again, any questions you have as you review that final assessment, start working on, feel free to shoot me an email and I'm happy to give you a response, even though I'll be traveling a little bit. The midterm assessments that have not come in yet, the ones that will be coming in tonight, the closer they come in to midnight, the less likely it is that they'll be graded until maybe Thursday or Friday, because I'm traveling tomorrow and I'm teaching another class from where I'm at tomorrow night. So chances are they won't be graded until maybe Thursday or Friday, but you do have until midnight tonight to complete the midterm assessment. All right. Okay, I'll get this recording up onto our Canvas site. I'll try and do it tonight because I'm leaving early tomorrow morning. So I'll try and get it up there tonight. It does take a few minutes to process. And so if you see it pop up there within an hour and you click on it, it says it's not available. It just means that it's still processing. So usually it takes maybe hour or two for it to process and to get all the subtitles on it. So just be patient, but it should be available by later tonight. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Hope you have a good remainder of your week and let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I'll talk to you then again next Tuesday. So take care. Thank you.